The funeral pyre had not yet cooled when they came for Isolde Vane. She stood at the edge of the Ashford churchyard, her black mourning gown still carrying the char smell of grief. Her father's silver ring clutched so tightly in her palm that the raised crest had bitten a crescent into her skin. 3 months she had nursed him. 3 months of watching the life drain from the man who had raised her in the shadow of Valethorn Forest, who had spoken in the last hours of his fever of debts, older than she was, of a name she was never to say aloud unless her life depended upon it. She had not understood him then. She understood now. There were 4 of them. They moved without the sound of footsteps, without the displacement of air that a human body ought to make when crossing frost-hardened ground. The tallest wore a coat of deep charcoal that swept the earth like a second shadow, and his eyes, when the torchlight caught them, were not the amber of wolves or the pale gray of illness. They were the color of old garnet held against a candle, dark red, lit from within, utterly without warmth. "Isolde Margaret Vane," said the one nearest to her. Not a question, a summons. He was younger looking than the others, his jaw angular, his tone carrying the casual authority of someone who had never once been refused. "You are required before the conclave of the 6. Her breath came out in a white plume. "My father is not yet a week in the ground. Your father's arrangements with the conclave did not perish with him. You are his heir. The obligation transfers." She looked at the ring in her palm. "Cassius Vane will honor what I could not if you go to him willingly." Those had been her father's exact words, spoken with his cracked lips and his eyes already growing dim. She had assumed, in her ignorance, that Cassius Vane was a solicitor, a land agent, some gray-templed gentleman of property who held a lien on Ashford Cottage. She had not assumed this. The forest behind the churchyard shifted. Not the shifting of wind through branches, there was no wind, but the displacement of something immense and very old changing its position. The 4 figures before her went still in a way that living creatures did not go still. Their attention moved, collectively, from her to the tree line. He stepped out of the dark between the oaks as though the dark had simply chosen to release him. Cassius Vane stood perhaps 30 yards from her, and even at that distance the quality of his stillness was extraordinary. He was tall in the manner of old portraits, not merely in height but in proportion, as though he had been composed rather than born. Dark hair, unpowdered, fell to his collar. His coat was black. His eyes, when they settled on her, were not red like the others. They were the precise, starless black of a sky from which every constellation had been erased. "She is not going before the conclave tonight," he said. His voice was low and without inflection, the kind of voice that did not require volume to fill a space completely. The angular-jawed one turned. "My Lord Vane, the conclave summons is a piece of paper." A pause. "And I am the king." The word did not carry pride. It carried the weight of something ancient and immovable, the way a stone foundation carries a house without calling attention to itself. Isolde felt it in the base of her sternum, a vibration beneath language. The 4 exchanged something, not looks, exactly, but a communion that did not require faces, and then, without another word, they withdrew into the dark. She was alone with him. He did not approach immediately. He stood at the tree line and regarded her with an expression she could not read from this distance, could not have read even if he had been standing directly before her, she suspected. His face was the kind of face that had spent centuries composing itself into something that gave nothing away. "Your father told you my name," he said, across the distance. "In his last hours." Her voice held. She was proud of that. "He said you would honor his debt. His debt to the conclave is not a debt I can dissolve, but how it is paid." He paused. "That remains within my authority, for now. For now." The words hung in the frost air like something with edges. She looked at this man, this creature who had walked out of the forest and scattered 4 of his own kind with 3 sentences, and she thought of her father's voice in the dark. "Go to him willingly. He is old, but he is not unkind." "What happens to me if I go with you?" she asked. The silence before his answer was exactly long enough to be honest. "I don't yet know," said Cassius Vane, "but you will be alive to find out." She took 1 step toward the forest, and then another. and the night folded around her like a vow she had not yet agreed to keep. Valethorn Manor did not announce itself the way grand houses announced themselves. There was no sweeping gravel approach, no symmetrical facade lit by carriage lamps, no butler waiting at the foot of wide stone steps. The manor emerged from the forest the way a memory emerged from sleep. Gradually, partially, and with the quality of something that had always been present but had chosen, until now, not to be seen. One moment there were trees. Then there was a wall of ancient sandstone the color of dried blood, taller than the oaks, and gates of wrought iron whose scrollwork depicted not the conventional leaves or flourishes of aristocratic taste, but something Isolde could not name in the dark, figures perhaps, or simply the suggestion of figures recurring in the iron like a warning repeated in a language almost extinct. He did not speak during the walk, neither did she. She had learned, in the years of nursing her father through the long declining months, that there was a difference between silence that was empty and silence that was full. Her father's silences near the end had been full of everything he could no longer say. Cassius Vane's silence was full in a different way, not with suppressed speech, but with the weight of time itself, as though centuries of accumulated thought had rendered ordinary conversation superfluous. She was shown to a room on the second floor by a woman named Petra, who moved with the economy of long service and offered no explanation for anything. The room was large and cold and furnished with pieces that Isolde recognized as old, not antique in the fashionable sense, but genuinely old, worn smooth by generations of hands that were no longer present to account for themselves. A fire had been laid and lit. A tray of food sat on a small table by the window. Bread, cold meat, a glass of dark liquid that turned out, when she tasted it with great caution, to be elderberry wine. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the fire instead, her father's ring on her finger now, and thought about obligation. About debts. About what, precisely, her father had promised on her behalf and whether she had any right to be angry with a dead man for it. She had decided, somewhere in the third hour of the night, that she did not. That grief was too recent and too close for anger to have proper room, when a sound reached her from beneath the floor, not a mechanical sound, not the settling of old wood or the complaint of pipes, a voice, very low, speaking in a language she did not recognize, rhythmic and without pause, like something being recited from long memory. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Then silence. Then, after a pause of exactly 3 heartbeats, she counted them, a single sharp sound, as of glass breaking. Then nothing. She pulled her shawl tighter and told herself it was not her concern. She was wrong. In the morning, a pale, reluctant morning that seemed to consider the sky for a long time before committing to actual light, Cassius Vane came to her. He knocked before entering, which surprised her. She had not thought of him as someone who knocked. He looked the same as he had in the graveyard, which was to say, he looked like someone who had looked the same for a very long time. There were no signs of a night spent wakeful, no shadows beneath the eyes, no looseness in the set of his shoulders. He was simply present, the way a piece of old architecture was present, without apology, without alteration. "The conclave has sent a formal notice," he said from just inside the doorway. He did not come further. She noticed that, the precise maintenance of distance, as though he had calculated it. "They will grant me 40 days to resolve the matter of your father's debt before they require your direct appearance." 40 days. She repeated it to hear its weight. "And what is the debt, precisely?" Something moved in his expression. Not quite discomfort. She did not think that word applied to him, but something adjacent to it. A restraint, perhaps. The performance of restraint around something that required it. "Your father's bloodline carries a marker," he said, "a heritable resonance that the conclave has considered their property for 3 generations. They believe it was pledged to them before you were born." Pledged. The word tasted like something wrong. "I was pledged." "Your father pledged the marker." He was not fully aware of what that meant. Another pause. "He was not, in the end, fully aware of what I am. And what are you?" The black eyes settled on her face with a quality of attention that was not quite the attention of anything she had encountered before. It was total. It was old. It held her in place the way gravity held things in place, not through force but through simple, absolute precedence. "I am the authority the conclave answers to," he said, "which means I am also the only entity capable of standing between you and them." "That sounds like leverage," she said quietly. "It is not meant as such." "Then what is it meant as?" The pause this time was longer. He looked briefly at the window, at the pale, stubborn morning pressing against the glass, and something passed across his face that she would think about for a long time afterward. Something that did not belong to kings or to creatures who had lived through centuries of other people's deaths. Something human-shaped, if not precisely human. "A fact," he said at last. "Simply a fact." But when he left, closing the door with the soft finality of someone choosing their words very carefully, she noticed that he had not once, in the entire conversation, told her she was safe. She learned the shape of Valethorn Manor in the days that followed, the way one learned the shape of a foreign language. Not through instruction, but through immersion and the gradual accumulation of evidence. The East Wing was sealed. She had discovered this on her second morning by the simple expedient of walking its corridor until she encountered a door that would not respond to her hand, not locked in any mechanical sense but simply impassable. The wood cool beneath her palm in a way that felt less like absence of heat than presence of deliberate cold. Petra, when consulted, had looked at her with the careful blankness of someone who had been asked this question many times and had long ago settled on not answering it. The library was not sealed. It occupied the entirety of the manor's ground floor north face, its shelves climbing to a ceiling lost in shadow, its contents organized not alphabetically, nor by subject, but in a logic as Olde spent several days trying to decode before concluding that the logic was temporal, the books arranged not by what they were about but by when they had entered this house. The earliest volumes, nearest the far wall, were in languages she could not read. The most recent, nearest the door she'd entered through, were in English, though several were in a hand she did not recognize as any published authors. She was 3 days into the library when she found him there. He was standing at the far end, near the oldest shelves, his back to her, reading. He held the book in one hand with the unconscious ease of someone who had held thousands of books. He did not turn when she entered, could not have heard her footsteps, she thought, over the general silence, but after a moment he said without inflection, "The third shelf from the left contains botanical records from the 17th century. You may find them more relevant to your interests than the ecclesiastical histories you've been working through." She stopped walking. "How did you know what I'd been reading? The books are not replaced in precisely the positions they occupied before." He turned then, unhurried, and she was struck again by the quality of his attention when it landed on her, that complete, ancient, undemanding regard. It was not surveillance. The house notices things. The house. And after enough centuries, the distinction between a place and its inhabitant blurs. She considered this. It was the most he had offered voluntarily since her arrival. She took it with the care one took with things that might not be offered again. "How many centuries?" she asked. He returned to his book. Not dismissively, there was nothing dismissive in his manner, but with the naturalness of someone for whom the question was of moderate interest rather than great import, enough that the word loses its meaning. They accumulate. Time becomes horizontal rather than vertical. You cease to move through it and begin instead to simply occupy it. That sounds lonely. The quality of his stillness changed, very slightly. She would not have noticed it if she had not been watching him with the attention she had learned, in recent days, was required to read him at all. The small vocabulary of a face that had spent lifetimes composing itself into legibility for no one. "Yes," he said. "Simply that." She went to the third shelf from the left and found the botanical records, and because the alternative was standing in charged silence, she sat at the long reading table and opened the first volume. The drawings inside were extraordinary, detailed to the point of obsession. Annotated in a cramped hand she gradually recognized as the same hand she had seen in the English-language volumes near the entrance. His hand. She looked up. He was still reading, still turned partly away, and the firelight from the grate at the room's center found his profile in the manner that firelight found old stone. Not warming it, exactly, but revealing the texture already there, the depth of it, the way centuries of specific weather had shaped a surface into something particular and irreplaceable. She looked back down at the page. "My father," she said after a careful silence. "What did he know of you, truly?" A pause. "He knew that I had once offered his grandmother protection, that there were terms, that the terms outlasted him." "What kind of protection?" "The kind that requires living through a winter when the conclave had decided otherwise." His tone did not change. It never changed. Held always at that same controlled, measured register that seemed less chosen than constitutive. "Your great-grandmother's bloodline carries what the conclave call a resonance. In practical terms, it means that certain old workings respond to her blood and to yours in ways they do not respond to others. The conclave has wanted that capacity under their direct control for a long time, and you prevented it. 3 times. He closed his book. "This is the 4th. She sat with that for a moment. 4 generations. 4 times this man, this creature, had inserted himself between her family and something that wished them harm. She thought of her father's voice. He is old, but he is not unkind. She thought of all the ways that sentence could be true and still leave enormous room for things she did not yet know. "Why?" she asked. The word was small and direct, and she meant it entirely. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. "Your great-grandmother asked me once to choose between law and conscience," he said at last. "I chose conscience. The rest has been consequence." He left before she could ask what law he meant, and what, precisely, 4 generations of consequence had cost him so far. On the 9th night, the east wing opened, not because someone unlocked it. Isolde had been in the corridor outside her room when it happened, a sound not unlike the slow exhale of a held breath, and then the door at the end of the passage simply stood open, dark beyond it, the cold pouring out like something that had been waiting a long time for release. She would tell herself later that she had not been thinking clearly, that the novelty of the open door after 9 days of its refusal had overridden her better judgment. This was partly true. The other part of the truth, the part she did not examine immediately, was that some quality of the dark beyond it called to her in a register she could not quite name, a vibration just below hearing that seemed less external than internal, as though it were her own blood rather than any sound from the passage that had drawn her forward. She had taken perhaps 7 steps into the wing when she found the broken glass. It lay on the stone floor in a wide scatter, the pieces irregular and very fine, catching the thin light from a high window, a decanter, perhaps, or a vial, something that had held liquid, because the floor around it was stained with something dark. She told herself it was wine and then crouched to look more closely and understood, with a certainty that settled before thought did, that it was not wine. She reached toward one of the larger pieces, thinking to collect it, thinking of nothing more useful than that the floor should not be dangerous, and the edge of it opened the pad of her first finger as cleanly as a surgical instrument. She made no sound. The pain was clean and sharp and immediate, and the blood welled up at once, dark in the low light, tracing the line of her finger and falling to the stone floor with a small, deliberate sound. The world changed. There was no other word adequate to it. The room. The cold, silent, dark-stained room, contracted and then expanded, and then filled with something that was not light and not sound, but partook of both, a sensation of weight, of memory, of time moving sideways through her chest. She saw, without seeing, the images arriving behind her closed eyes though she had not closed them. A woman she did not know standing in a garden in a century she did not recognize, and the woman's face was her own face, and beside her stood a figure she knew even in the vision by the quality of his stillness. Cassie's vein, unchanged, the same coat, the same black eyes, and in his expression something that his present face had been disciplined out of, something open, something that had not yet learned to be withheld. Then hands on her shoulders, drawing her upright, and the vision dissolved. "Don't touch it," he said. His voice was the same as always, controlled, low, without inflection, but there was a tautness beneath it now, a quality of something very tightly held. She could feel the cold of him through her sleeves, the grip not hard but absolute, the way a doorframe was absolute when you caught it in a moment of falling. She looked at him. He was looking at her finger, at the blood, She watched his face with the close attention she had learned was necessary to read him, and what she saw was not hunger, not what she might have expected from the literature she had consumed as a frightened child, from the folk tales she had dismissed as an adult. It was something more complicated than hunger, something that looked, in the one unguarded second before he composed himself, like recognition, like grief, like a man encountering a familiar face in a place where it had no right to be. "What was that?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was distantly proud of that, what I saw. Blood memory. He released her and stepped back, the precise maintenance of distance reinstated with the finality of a decision. "Your bloodline carries it. Direct contact with old blood, or your own blood in proximity to it, can trigger inherited vision. It is not a gift. The woman I saw was your great-grandmother." A pause. His jaw held a stillness that was not quite the same as his usual stillness. This one had something to push against. "Her name was Marguerite. She was in a garden with you." "Yes. And you were looking at her the way." She stopped, reconsidered the wisdom of finishing the sentence. He waited. He was very good at waiting. She suspected he had had centuries of practice. "You were young," she said instead, which was both true in the vision and clearly false in any objective sense, and they both understood what she had chosen not to say by saying it. "I was less old than I am now," he agreed. "Come." He moved toward the door, away from the scattered glass and the blood-stained floor, not looking back. "Your hand needs attention, and this wing should not have been accessible." Why was it? He paused at the doorway. The torchlight from the corridor caught the edge of his profile and she thought again, with the same disorienting clarity she had felt in the library, that his face was something that had been, shaped by an extraordinary amount of specific experience, that it held the record of it the way stone held water damage, indelibly, without display. "Because something in this house," he said quietly, "appears to believe you should know what you are, and I confess I am not entirely certain it is wrong." Behind her, on the stained floor of the sealed east wing, her blood had spread in a perfect circle, and at its exact center, the scattered glass had begun, without wind or touch, to tremble. He told her about Marguerite Vane in the library, on the 12th day, in the way that people told stories they had kept too long, not all at once but in pieces, as though testing the weight of each one before committing it to the open air. Isolde sat across the long table from him and did not interrupt. She had discovered that interruption was, with Cassius Vane, the shortest route to a subject's foreclosure. He spoke in the manner of someone to whom speech was a considered act, rather than a reflexive one, and any external pressure on the rhythm of it produced silence rather than acceleration. Marguerite Vane had been, by his account, a woman of unusual perceptiveness, not supernatural perceptiveness. She had been entirely human, the bloodline resonance, an inheritance she neither understood nor used consciously, but the ordinary human perceptiveness that was the province of people who had survived difficult things by watching carefully. She had come to Valethorn in the winter of 1743 in flight from a conclave summons that she'd been warned of by a priest who had no business knowing of the conclave's existence. The priest was dead before she arrived. Cassius did not elaborate on this point, and Isolde chose, for reasons she could not entirely articulate, not to ask. "She stayed for 4 months, he said. "The conclave negotiated. I imposed terms they could not easily refuse." A pause. "When she left, I offered her a formal arrangement, a blood compact that would have brought her bloodline under my direct protection, with my authority as guarantee. She refused?" The question sat between them for a moment. "She accepted a partial version," he said, "without the binding element. She did not wish." He stopped, began again. She had a life, a husband she had left behind in the flight. She wished to return to it. A full compact would have complicated that return in ways that were not fair to ask of her. Isolde listened to the texture of his restraint as much as the content of his words. He had the manner of a man providing facts from which he had been careful to excise certain things. Not lies exactly, but an editorial precision that left certain rooms in the account unfurnished. "You cared for her," she said. not an accusation. Simply an observation, offered with the same quietness he used for his own observations. The quality of his stillness changed. She was remarkable, he said, and it was the most unguarded sentence she had heard from him. The conclave has never understood that what they seek to claim in your bloodline is not a weapon. It is a quality of attention. Your great-grandmother could see what was true, not supernaturally. Simply, accurately, it is rarer than power. And you believe I have it? His gaze moved to her, and she understood, from the particular quality of that look, that he had been avoiding it for the past several minutes. I believe, he said carefully, that you have not yet had reason to use it. There is a difference. She thought about the blood memory, about the garden, about the face of the woman who had been her great-grandmother, and the face of the man sitting across from her, 300 years younger in the vision and already possessed of that quality of controlled ancient watchfulness. She thought about what it meant that a creature of Cassius Vane's age and authority had, for 4 generations, placed himself between her family and the mechanism of something called the Conclave of the Six. What does the Conclave want the resonance for? She asked, concretely. He turned the page of the book he had not been reading. There is a ritual, he said. Old, pre-conclave by several centuries. It requires a blood anchor, a human bloodline with natural resonance, to enact a permanent suppression of the boundary between living and dead blood. In practical terms, it would allow the conclave to extend their authority beyond the constraints that currently limit it. What constraints? Me. He said it without pride, in the same tone he might have used to name a piece of furniture. My authority over the conclave derives from the same ancient law that created them. If the boundary suppression succeeds, that law becomes functionally void. They would no longer require my sanction for any action. The clarity of it settled over her like cold water. They want my blood to free themselves from your authority, she said slowly, and you, by protecting me, are also protecting your throne. He did not look away from her, did not shift in his chair or alter his expression. Yes, he said, that is accurate, so I should not assume that your reasons are. She searched for the right word. Purely altruistic. No, he said, you should not assume that. Another pause. I would ask only that you also do not assume they are purely political. The fire in the grate settled, sending a brief pulse of warmth across the table between them. She looked at him in the altered light, at the careful face, the composed hands, the eyes that held whatever they held, without offering it for examination. She thought about a garden in 1743 and a man who had not yet learned to keep that look off his face. The partial compact my great-grandmother accepted, she said. What were its terms? That her line would have the right of appeal to me, above the conclave, in any matter touching their lives, and that I would answer that appeal. For how long? The pause this time had the weight of something ancient being acknowledged, for the first time in a very long while. She did not set a limit, he said, and I did not ask for one. Isolde turned that sentence over and over in the privacy of her own mind as she walked back to her room, and found that no matter which way she looked at it, it carried the unmistakable shape of a promise made to someone long dead and kept without being asked. He had not expected the blood memory. In 300 years of carrying the partial compact, in 3 generations of quiet, peripheral guardianship, of legal maneuvering within conclave chambers and the soft deployment of authority in back corridors, the bloodline resonance had remained dormant, theoretical. A quality he knew to exist in the abstract, the way one knew that powder was explosive, with full intellectual acknowledgement and no immediate concern. Isolde Vane's blood on the floor of the East Wing had woken every ward in the house simultaneously. He had felt it from the lower levels, a deep structural vibration like the hull of a ship encountering the resonance of its own bell. He had been up the stairs before the second harmonic finished, and in the East Wing doorway while she was still standing and the glass was still moving and her expression was the expression of someone, returning from a great distance, blinking back to the present tense. He had held her shoulders and looked at the blood and felt something he had not been prepared to feel. Recognition was too simple a word. It was the thing beneath recognition. the particular quality of a face encountered in a context where it had no right to make sense, and making sense anyway, in a way that bypassed reasoning and went directly to the older architecture. She looked like Marguerite the way a river looked like the rain that had made it, not identical, but the same substance, shaped by different ground. He sat now in the lower levels of the East Wing, in the room the conclave did not know existed, and reviewed what he had committed himself to, with the cold accuracy he applied to all legal problems. The conclave had 40 days, 22 remained. In 22 days they would send a formal delegation, not the 4 he had dispersed at the churchyard, but a full chamber delegation, 6 elders, with authority he could challenge but not indefinitely refuse. Under the ancient law that undergirded everything, a human hereditary obligation to the conclave could be suspended by royal authority for no longer than 60 days without a permanent resolution being registered. Permanent resolution meant one of 3 things: transfer of the obligation to a sanctioned third party, dissolution through satisfaction of the original debt's terms, or revocation, which required a king's formal abdication of the original interference, retroactive to the first instance. 3 centuries ago he had interfered. He had placed his authority between Marguerite Vane and the conclave, and he had known, with full clarity, that he was beginning a sequence he could not easily terminate. He had done it anyway. There had been reasons at the time that he had examined thoroughly and found sound. The conclave's ritual was dangerous not only to the individual bloodline, but to the broader structure of the law itself. His intervention had been legally defensible on those grounds alone, without reference to the woman in the garden and the accuracy of her attention and the particular way she had looked at him as though she could see what he actually was, rather than what he had spent centuries composing himself to appear. The legally defensible reasons were still valid. They had remained valid through 3 generations of quiet obligation. They were perhaps less complete in the 22nd day of Isolde Vane's presence in his house than they had once been. He understood the danger of this. He was not a creature who misread his own states. He had too much practice with his own interior for that. He knew the difference between the controlled, peripheral care he had extended to the bloodline for 3 centuries, and whatever was currently occurring in his chest when he thought about the blood on the East Wing floor and the expression on her face when she came back from the vision and said, in that careful, steady voice, "You were looking at her, the way," and had not finished the sentence. He was grateful for that. He was also, in the quieter register, not grateful for it, because an unfinished sentence left a space that thought would continue to fill, regardless of his wishes. He had 22 days to find a permanent resolution that did not require her blood, did not dissolve his authority, and did not constitute the revocation that would leave her unprotected from the conclave permanently. He had reviewed the legal literature 3 times in the past week. The options were narrowing. There was one option he had not yet reviewed aloud, not because it was unavailable. It was entirely available, had been available since the moment the ancient law was written, but because invoking it would require him to say certain things directly to Isolde Vane, that he had no business saying to a woman who had been in his house for 12 days, and who looked like her great-grandmother, and who had the quality, in moments of stillness, of being able to see exactly what was true. The option was a full compact. Voluntary, bilateral, permanent. A blood covenant between the bloodline holder and the authority who claimed her protection, registered with the conclave as a prior and superseding obligation that no hereditary debt could override. It was legal. It was inviolable. It was, under the ancient law, the one instrument that could end this permanently. It was also, in ways the law did not bother to articulate, something else entirely. He sat in the lower levels of the East Wing and looked at the legal text he knew by memory and thought about Marguerite, who had accepted a partial version, who had chosen her husband and her ordinary human life, who had been, in that choice, entirely right. And he thought about Isolde, who had said simply, "You should not assume they are purely altruistic," and who had looked at him, in the library firelight, with eyes that saw what was actually there. 22 days. He extinguished the lamp and sat in the dark and knew, with the clarity of a man who had spent 3 centuries being honest with himself about everything except this, that he was running out of time in more than one sense. The conclave's delegation arrived on the 19th day, not the 40th. Isolde heard the iron gates before she saw anything. A deep, bell-like reverberation that seemed to travel not through the air but through the stone of the manor itself, floor to ceiling, the way sound moved in old churches. She was in the library when it happened, and she stood up from the table with the wordless understanding that something had shifted, that the quality of time in the house had changed the way weather changed before a storm, not yet arrived but already decided. Petra appeared in the doorway. "You should remain here," she said. It was the longest sentence Petra had offered since Isolde's arrival, and its length made its urgency unmistakable. "What's happening? The Six have sent their chamber delegation early. My lord did not expect." A pause that held something Isolde had not seen in Petra before. Not fear exactly, but its precursor. "Please remain here." She remained for 8 minutes. Then she went to the entrance hall. The delegation stood in the manor's main vestibule, and they were not the 4 she had encountered at the churchyard. These were older. She could feel it before she could see it. A quality of age that pressed against the senses the way pressure pressed against the ears at depth. 6 of them, uniformly still, uniformly silent, their faces arranged in the particular composure of entities who had decided on an outcome before entering a room. Cassius stood before them. She had seen him in stillness, and she had seen him in motion. She had seen him in the library, and she had seen him in the East Wing corridor with his hands on her shoulders and his face stripped, for 1 second, of its composition. She had not seen this. Cassius Vane, with his full authority deployed, standing between 6 ancient entities in the room she had just walked out of, and the quality of the space around him was the quality of an absolute boundary, not physical, not atmospheric, but legal, as though the ancient law itself had taken the form of a man and chosen to stand in a doorway. "You are 21 days early," he said. "Our compact with the Vane bloodline predates your intervention by 2 generations," said the elder at the delegation center. Her hair was white, and her voice was the white of old bone. "We are not bound by your extension. You are bound by my authority." "Your authority," she said, "is precisely what we are here to discuss." A silence fell. Isolde was standing at the turn of the corridor, half visible, and she watched Cassius's back and the delegation's faces and understood, from the small adjustments in the elder's attention, that they had noticed her, that her presence was, in some way she did not yet fully understand, relevant to what they were doing here. "The bloodline resonance has activated," said another elder, male, younger seeming, his eyes the deep garnet of the 4 at the churchyard. "We detected it 18 days ago. Blood contact with the East Wing material." He paused. "You know what that means under the terms of the original compact." "I know what you believe it means. It means the ritual can be enacted within the lunar cycle. The window opens in 3 days. His voice held nothing, no satisfaction, no particular menace, simply the recitation of fact. The bloodline holder must appear before the chamber by dawn of the 3rd day, or the compact defaults to involuntary collection. There will be no involuntary collection while I am king. Then, abdicate, said the white-haired elder, and the word fell into the silence of the vestibule with the weight of something that had been prepared in advance. Abdicate the interference. Register the revocation retroactively. Let the original compact stand. You will retain your throne. Your authority remains intact, and the bloodline obligation is resolved under existing law. A pause. It is the cleanest resolution available. Isolde's breath was very careful in her chest. She watched him. She watched the quality of his stillness as he processed the offer, the legal analysis happening in silence. The review of options she now understood had been conducted many times already, and she thought about 22 days becoming 3, and about a woman in the 1743 garden, and about a man who had not asked for a limit on a promise and had never been given one. "No," he said. One word, no inflection, no elaboration. "No," she said, from the corridor. Every head in the vestibule turned. Cassius turned last, slowly, and his face was the face she had seen in the East Wing, stripped, for a second, of its centuries of composition. Then it was not. But she had seen it. "I am the bloodline holder," she said. She walked toward them, keeping her voice steady with the same effort she had applied to it at the churchyard 100 years ago. It felt like, "Whatever compact exists with my bloodline is mine to resolve, not his. Mine." The white-haired elder looked at her with interest that was not quite cold. "Then you understand the alternatives." "Tell me the alternatives," Isolde said, "and I will." She felt Cassius move to stand beside her, not behind her, not in front of her, but precisely beside her. And the warmth she expected to feel was not warmth at all, but the cold of something ancient and irrevocable choosing, without legal obligation, to stay. The delegation left before midnight with a 3-day ultimatum and the barely perceptible satisfaction of entities who believed they had already won. Cassius said nothing for a long time after the iron gates closed. Isolde stood beside him in the entrance hall and waited, because she had learned that waiting was the appropriate response, and because her own thoughts required ordering before she could do anything useful with them. "You should not have come out," he said at last. His voice held something she had not heard before. Not quite anger, but the controlled exhalation of something that had been held tightly while witnesses were present, and could now, with the witnesses gone, be marginally released. "You were about to sacrifice your throne," she said. "That was my choice to make. It was a choice about my bloodline. That makes it mine as well." She turned to face him. He was looking at the closed gate. "They said abdicate the interference, which means abdicate 300 years of it, all of it." She paused. "You would have lost the protection you extended to my great-grandmother. Retroactively, it would have been as though none of it happened. I am aware of what it would have meant. Then you understand why I came out." He turned from the gate. His eyes settled on her with that quality she had come to recognize as his fullest attention, and she held it without looking away. Because whatever he was reading in her face she was willing for him to read. "What do you know of the alternatives?" he said after a moment. "What they told you in the vestibule. They told me that if I present myself to the chamber voluntarily within 3 days, the original compact can be resolved by my direct participation in the ritual, after which the resonance is transferred or depleted, and my bloodline is released from obligation permanently." She paused. They were careful to avoid the word sacrifice. I noticed that. Something in his jaw. "It is not precisely sacrifice. It is depletion. The resonance is bound to the living blood. Enacting the ritual requires sustaining the working long enough to transfer its anchor. The process would..." He stopped. "Your bloodline would end with you." "I have no children," she said. "No immediate family. The line ends with me regardless. You are 23 years old. I am also standing in a room with someone who has spent 3 centuries preventing this outcome, and I want to understand why before I decide what to do about it." She kept her voice even. This was important. "You said your reasons were not purely political. I am asking what the other part is." The fire in the entrance hall grate had burned low while the delegation was present, as though the cold they brought had suppressed it, and now it was building again, casting an unsteady gold over the stone floor and the angles of his face. She had thought, early in her time here, that his face was composed and unreachable. She understood now that it was composed against something, that the quality of its restraint indicated not absence but presence, the way the surface of deep water indicated depth rather than shallowness. "You know what the other part is," he said quietly. "I want you to say it." A pause so long she thought he would not. "Then, your great-grandmother saw what was true. I told you that. What I did not tell you is that what she saw when she looked at me was the first honest account anyone had offered in a very long time." He did not move. His voice did not change. She looked at me and she said, "You are lonely in a way that has no cure except the willingness to be seen by someone who remains." And then she chose not to remain. The fire shifted. The gold moved across the floor between them. "I kept her compact," he said, "because I intended to honor it. And because..." He stopped. "Because it was the last connection to a conversation I had been having, in my own mind, for 300 years. She crossed the space between them, not all of it. She stopped within arm's reach, which was a distance she had not breached before, and she could feel the cold of him clearly at this range, distinct from the cold of the room, an ancient cold that was its own climate. His hands were at his sides. He did not move them. "I am not my great-grandmother," she said. "I know. I am not a continuation of that conversation." I know that too. His voice was very low. She was remarkable in ways specific to her. You are remarkable in ways specific to yourself. And I am aware, acutely aware, that conflating them would be both dishonest and an insult to you. I am not conflating them. She looked at him, at the black eyes that held their contents without offering them, that were offering them now to her, with the quality of something that had not been opened in a very long time and was not certain the mechanism still worked. Then what are you doing? She asked. He lifted one hand, slowly, and touched the back of it to her jaw. Not a caress exactly, but an acknowledgement. The cold of it moved through her with the quality of the blood memory. That lateral movement of time and recognition, except that this was entirely present. Entirely now. Tryin', he said, to find a third auction. She did not move away from his hand, and in the silence of the entrance hall, with 3 days left and the fire rebuilding itself from almost nothing, that stillness felt like the most consequential thing that had happened since the night the coven came for her. He spent the first of the 3 days in the lower levels of the East Wing with the ancient law texts and did not come up until the afternoon of the second day, when he appeared in the library doorway with his coat less composed than usual and a quality of absolute certainty she had not seen him wear before. Not the political certainty of authority, but something quieter and more permanent. The kind of certainty that survived examination because it had already withstood it. There is a third option, he said. She closed her book. Tell me. The voluntary full compact. He came into the room and stood at the end of the long table, on the same side as her rather than opposite it, and she noticed this. Bilateral. Permanent. If a bloodline holder enters a full compact voluntarily with an authority who claims prior and superseding guardianship, the original conclave compact is legally voided. Not suspended, voided, retroactively, with no further obligation on either party. What does the full compact require? A direct blood covenant, witnessed by the ancient law itself. The ritual is self-registering. It requires no conclave acknowledgement. A pause. It requires voluntary consent, specifically articulated, and it is. He searched for the appropriate word with the same care he brought to all speech. Irreversible. In what sense? In the sense that my authority over your bloodline becomes absolute, not in the manner the conclave means by that word, but legally, no other claim can supersede it, and your bloodline becomes formally and permanently tied to my line. He held her gaze. It means that whatever I am, you are connected to it, permanently. She sat with this for a moment. And what does it mean for you? He was quiet. She watched the quality of his restraint and understood, from long study, that the restraint was not evasion, but precision. The particular care of someone making sure the words were equal to what they were trying to describe. It means I cannot surrender the protection I offered, ever, not willingly, not under legal pressure. A pause. It also means, and I want to be honest with you about this, that the compact registers at the level of blood memory. What we each carry of one another after is not merely legal. The ancient law is old enough that it does not fully distinguish between those categories. You are telling me that it is a kind of bond. Yes. Between us. Yes. He held her gaze with everything. His face was finally allowing to be visible. And I am telling you this before asking for your answer, because you have the right to know what you would be consenting to. I am not Marguerite's guardian, offering her bloodline protection at arm's length. If you consent to this compact, it is between you and me, directly and permanently, and it is, in ways I cannot entirely map in advance, more than legal. Isolde looked at him, at the face she had spent 30 days learning to read, that had been composed for centuries against the necessity of being read, that was now, in this afternoon light, as close to legible as she suspected it had been since a garden in 1743, and a woman who had looked at him and seen what was true. She thought about her father's ring on her finger. She thought about what her life had been. The years of nursing, the smallness of the cottage, and the patience of quiet days, the absence of anything that had reached her the way this house had reached her, the way his voice in the dark of the churchyard had reached her. You will be alive to find out. She thought about whether she was being rational. She decided that rationality was a standard developed for conditions that had not included the last 30 days. "What does it require, specifically?" she said. "The ritual." He sat down, for the first time in her memory, choosing the chair beside her rather than across from her. "I speak the compact's terms aloud. You acknowledge them. We exchange blood, a small amount, a formality in volume but not in significance." He paused. "And we remain, present to one another, willingly. That is all. The ancient law," he said, "does not require elaborate mechanisms, only genuine ones." She turned to face him at this new proximity, this besideness that was different from all the maintained distances of the past month. He was waiting with the absolute patience of something that had learned to wait without expecting, that had made its peace with outcomes that were not this one. She found that she could see it now, clearly, the 3 centuries of solitude worn smooth, the ancient loneliness that her great-grandmother had named, and she herself had sensed in every conversation, every maintained distance, every word chosen with the care of someone who had very little practice with being heard. She reached out and took his hand. The cold of it moved through her, the same as always. The ancient cold, the climate of something that had lived far longer than warmth. But underneath the cold, against her palm, she felt what she thought might be the faintest pulse, not a heartbeat. Something older than a heartbeat, a rhythm that had been ongoing alone for a very long time. "Tell me the terms," she said, and when he spoke, his voice for the first time had no restraint in it at all. Only the words themselves, and the weight of 300 years finally finding somewhere to come to rest. The conclave's delegation returned at dawn of the 3rd day and found the gates of Viltthorn Manor sealed. Not locked, sealed. In the manner of old workings, the iron warmer to the touch than iron ought to be at this hour, carrying in its latticed surface a faint resonance that the white-haired elder recognized before anyone else. She stood before the gate and pressed her palm against it and withdrew the hand slowly, without expression. "It has been done," she said. Inside the manor, Isolde was watching them from the upper window. She had been awake since before the dawn, and she felt, in a way she could not have described the previous morning, the warmth and the cold simultaneously, as though her blood now carried 2 temperatures and had learned, in the hours since the compact, to hold them without contradiction. The compact had been spoken in the library, at the long table, in the low light of what remained of the fire. He had spoken the ancient terms in the old language she had heard him speaking in the East Wing on her first night, and they had resolved, in the air between them, into English. Not translated but understood, the meaning arriving directly without the mediation of sound. She had acknowledged them aloud. He had opened the small wound at his wrist with one of the East Wing's surviving glass fragments, and she had pressed her cut finger to it, and the world had done the thing it did when truth and time intersected. It had been completely silent, and then it had not been silent at all, and what filled the silence was not sound, but the particular knowledge that something had shifted at the level of structure rather than surface. She had felt, at the moment of the compact's completion, every ward in Viltthorn Manor acknowledge her. Not as a guest, as something that the house now recognized with the same unceremonious certainty that it recognized its lord. She had not said this to Cassius. She suspected he already knew. At the gate, the white-haired elder stepped back. She looked up at the manor's face, at the stone and the sealed windows and the warm iron, and her expression was the expression of someone counting losses with professional precision. "He has exceeded his authority," she said to the delegation. "A bilateral compact with a bloodline holder, enacted voluntarily, within the jurisdiction of his own claim. He has grounds." A pause. "We must review the legal position." "We have reviewed it," said the garnet-eyed elder. "It is valid." A silence fell among the 6. The Isolde watched it from the window. She was aware that she was watching a conclave as the 6 consider, for the first time in their collective history, that they had no available mechanism, that the ancient law they had relied upon to bring her to them had been invoked, more perfectly, by someone else first. She heard his footstep in the corridor. Unhurried even, familiar now in its exactness, the deliberate placement, the complete absence of unnecessary sound. He came to stand beside her at the window. "They will not go easily," he said. It was not a concern. It was an observation, delivered in his usual register, which she understood now contained not indifference, but the deep steadiness of something that had made its decision thoroughly and did not require continued reassurance of it. What will they do? Contest the compact's precedence over the original obligation, in the first instance. They will argue the original debt predates my initial interference and therefore cannot be superseded. He watched the delegation below without apparent concern. They will be incorrect. The ancient law is explicit. A voluntary bilateral compact is prior to all derivative claims, but they will argue it. For some time, yes. And during that time, he said, the compact stands. You are under my direct authority. They cannot approach you. She looked at him, at his profile, familiar now in the way that things became familiar through sustained, careful attention. The specific quality of the line of his jaw, the stillness that was not emptiness, the eyes that were currently occupied with watching the conclave accept a defeat 3 centuries in the making. You said it was more than legal, she said. The compact. Yes, I felt it. Last night. She paused. I feel the manner now as though it has always been mine. I feel. She searched for the word, an orientation, as though there is a direction that holds, regardless of where I am in the house. North. His stillness altered. The small vocabulary of it. She read it clearly now. Yes, he said. Very quietly. I had anticipated that aspect. Is it the same for you? The pause before his answer was not long, but it was absolute, the way his pauses were absolute when he was being particularly honest. It was already that way, he said. The compact formalized what was already the case. Below them, the delegation was beginning, finally, to withdraw. The white-haired elder cast one look up at the window, directly at Isolde, a look of complex assessment, not hostile, not entirely resigned, and then turned and followed the others into the tree line. The forest received them as it had received everything for centuries, without comment, without alteration. Isolde turned from the window. Cassius turned with her. They stood in the morning light of the corridor, and she thought about the word permanent and found it did not alarm her the way she might have expected. She thought about the coldness of his blood against hers and the warmth that had come after. The 2 temperatures she now carried, and about the garden in 1743 and her great-grandmother's choice, which had been the right choice for the person her great-grandmother was. She was not her great-grandmother. What does a king do, she asked, when the conclave is busy contesting his legal position? His mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile. It was the suggestion of a smile from a face that had a long way yet to travel before it fully remembered how. He continues governing, he said, and he finds the process, on certain mornings, considerably less solitary than it was. She walked beside him toward the library, and the manor held them both with equal warmth, and in the cold spaces between the old stones, something that had been waiting 300 years finally, with extraordinary patience, settled. 3 months after the conclave's formal legal challenge was filed, reviewed, and overturned by the apparatus of the ancient law, a process that had taken, by any reasonable standard, considerably less time than he had anticipated. Cassius Vane sat in the library in the late afternoon and watched Isolde read. She was at the far end of the table, her feet tucked beneath her in the chair in the manner she had adopted sometime in the 2nd month, a habit he had observed with the involuntary accuracy with which he observed everything about her. She was reading one of his old botanical volumes, the 17th century records from the East Wing with the cramped annotations in his handwriting, and she had the expression she wore when she found something of interest, a contained, internal alertness, visible only in the slight change in the set of her shoulders and the particular quality of her focus, which had the same directness as her great-grandmother's had and was entirely its own thing. He had been thinking about that a great deal in recent months. The relationship between inheritance and individuality, the way that what was passed through blood was never the person, only a tendency, a resonance, a quality of attention that each individual shaped through their own specific life into something irreducibly theirs. He had spent 3 centuries believing, in the quieter hours, that what he felt the loss of was Marguerite. He understood now, with the clarity available only to the honest, that what he had felt the loss of was the conversation she had begun, the possibility she had made visible, that he could be known and remain. The conversation had continued, as it turned out. It had simply required its own terms. The conclave's legal challenge had been, in the end, exactly as weak as he had predicted. The bilateral voluntary compact's precedence over hereditary debt was unambiguous in the ancient law. The challenge had consumed advocates' time and generated 11 depositions and 3 formal hearings, and had concluded, 62 days after it was filed, with a ruling that the white-haired elder had received with the expressionless composure of someone who had known, before filing, that this was the probable outcome, but who had considered the attempt worth making regardless. He respected that, in a way. The conclave had survived as long as it had, partly through the quality of its strategic thinking. They would try again. He did not doubt that. The resonance in Isolde's bloodline was too valuable to the conclave's long-term ambitions for them to abandon the objective entirely. They would find other instruments, other mechanisms, other interpretations of old law that might yet yield a workable claim. He would be ready for each one. This had been true for 3 centuries. The difference was that he was now ready for them from a position he had not occupied since before the tenure of any current elder, a position of having something beside the authority to protect, having something because of which the protection mattered at a level beneath political calculation. He was aware that what he felt for Isolde Vane was not what one was supposed to feel for someone who had come to one's house under legal constraint and stayed through the resolution of a crisis. He was aware that it had not been long enough, by any conventional measure, to be what it evidently was. He had spent some time, in the first weeks, attempting to apply conventional measures to it, and had concluded that conventional measures were designed for a time scale he no longer inhabited. He was very old. He had learned, through the experience of being very old, that the quality of a thing and the duration of exposure to it were not the same variable. He knew the quality of Isolde Vane. He had known it since the churchyard, since she had stood by her father's still-warm pyre and looked at 4 members of the conclave with the expression of someone who was frightened and intended not to show it, and had not shown it, and had asked, with the precise directness of someone who understood that honesty was more useful than composure, "What happens to me if I go with you?" He had told her he didn't know. That had been the truest thing he'd said in a very long time. He knew more now. She looked up from the botanical volume and found him watching her. She did not look away. This was characteristic of her, the willingness to hold whatever she found without deflecting from it, the inheritance of her great-grandmother's accuracy applied to the present rather than the past. "You annotated this one in 2 different hands," she said. "The margin notes near the back are in a different style. Faster, less deliberate. I wrote those in the first decade." He turned a page of his own book. "I was less settled then." "When did you become settled?" He looked at her across the long table in the afternoon light of the library, in the house that recognized her now as fully as it recognized him, and he thought about how to answer that honestly, without making her uncomfortable with the directness of the answer. He had been honest with her consistently for 4 months. He saw no reason to stop now. "Recently," he said. She considered this, a small color at the line of her jaw, which he had learned to recognize. She returned to the botanical volume and he returned to his book, and the library held its old silence around them, except that the silence was different now. Had been different since the compact, was the silence of 2 specific kinds of cold and warmth existing in the same space without resolving into either. It was, he thought, exactly what he had not known to want. It was what an honest conversation, begun 300 years ago in a garden in the presence of a remarkable woman, had been moving toward with the unhurried patience of old law. Not a resolution, not an ending, but the thing that persisted after endings. The orientation, the north, the temperature of 2 lives entered into each other's gravity and finding that gravity sufficient. Outside, the forest that had always been his forest, that had held its boundaries and its cold and its memory for longer than the manor itself, lay still in the last of the afternoon light. Inside, Isolde turned a page, the fire held,